I want to go ahead and again thank UNC Press for working with us. We've done a series of events with them in the store in person, and this is our first virtual one. And we're hoping to do some more of those as well while we can't meet in the store, and then, of course, to begin gathering again in the store as soon as we can. And so at this point, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Kostova to get things started. Elizabeth Kostova is the author of 3 novels, as well as essays, poetry, and short fiction. Her novel, The Historian, was the first novel in American publishing history to debut at #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list. And it won numerous awards and has been translated into 40 languages. Her most recent novel is The Shadowland. She's the co-founder of the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation, which provides competitive opportunities for Bulgarian writers and translators, as well as opportunities for native English writers to travel to Bulgaria. Kostova also serves on the University Council of the American University of Bulgaria and on the advisory board of the University of North Carolina Press. She lives here in Asheville with her family, and welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here as always. It's wonderful to be at Malaprops, even when we can't quite be at Malaprops. It's still been the hub of a community here, and we're all very grateful for what you do. And I'm also really honored to work with UNC Press. You may or may not know already that UNC Press publishes a lot of books, and it publishes, in fact, 125 books a year, about one new book every 3 days, which I just find so astonishing that I love getting to say it at the beginning of these presentations. I never get tired of that. I'm also really honored that one of my wonderful friends and the director of development from the UNC Press is here with us tonight, Joanna Ruth Marsland. Joanna Ruth, thank you so much for joining us from Chapel Hill. The books UNC Press publishes are quality books. They win, over half of them win awards every year, including the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize in History, and the Bancroft Prize. These books represent the heart of university press publishing in the US, and many of them are written by leading scholars for use in the academy, but also for the kind of general readership that we have here at Malaprops. And they are really an astonishing range. If you haven't ever picked up UNC Press catalog or looked it up online, I really encourage you to do that, because you will find books not only about North Carolina and state history and regional history, but also books on all kinds of aspects of culture, race, geography, and flora and fauna. So these are books that cover a very wide range of topics, and what I've said is just a small sample of the topics they do cover. We have a lot to celebrate at UNC Press. The press turns 100 in 2022. No other institution does what UNC Press does for North Carolina. It is keeping alive freedom of the press, sterling reputation of scholarship in our state, and carrying the name of the university across the globe. So please join me in celebrating UNC Press. And now I'd like to introduce a very special interviewer tonight, someone who is going to interview our author, our UNC Press author tonight. I'm really delighted about this because the person I'm going to introduce is not only a wonderful reader, writer, scholar, and minister, but also a friend and someone whose integrity and scholarship I really admire, and I think you're going to enjoy hearing from him. Here's his bio. The Reverend David C. Kirk Brown is the recently retired chaplain of Christ School here in Asheville. Kirk received his A.B. from Davidson College, his M.A. from the University of Virginia in Germanic Studies, and his Master's of Divinity from Virginia Theological Seminary. He is a lifelong educator, and I think those of us who know Kirk know that he is an educator in all of his life, and somebody who makes all of his friends want to read and learn, and a very special reader. He then attended seminary and was ordained as an Episcopal priest. After serving 3 years at St. John's Church in Roanoke, Virginia, he returned to schoolwork, serving 24 years as chaplain at Christ School and teaching religion. Kirk lives with his wife, Shelley, on a farm in Fletcher, here in the western part of the state. Please welcome Reverend Kirk Brown.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here. Quite humbling, frankly, to be here. I want to express my thanks to Malaprops as well for hosting tonight's event and so many others that have made this special bookstore such an important gathering place in Asheville. Never have we felt so starved for that sense of connectedness. And what a treasure the UNC Press is. I feel honored to play this small role in making sure more know about its important work and consider both Malaprops and the UNC Press precious gifts. So a couple of points to reinforce before I introduce our author tonight. One is that there will be time for questions at the end of our conversation, but 2 requests, please. One, kindly keep your microphones muted to preserve the quality of the experience for everyone. And please, as indicated before, please post your questions and comments in the chat box, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. Lauren Kerby grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, then attended college at Colgate University, where she fell in love with religious studies, how religion informs contemporary society. She then went on to complete her PhD at Boston University, focusing on American religious history and politics. It was then that the book we are discussing this evening began to take shape. Saving History: How White Evangelicals Toured the Nation's Capital and Redeem a Christian America, published this year by the UNC Press, is timely indeed. Lauren is also the education specialist for the Religious Literacy Project. Religious Literacy Project, easy for me to say. She works with educators and other professionals, including folks in media and journalism, to help them understand the complicated roles religions play in our country and pass that understanding on to their students or audiences. She currently teaches courses on religion and education, as well as religion and media at Harvard Divinity School and Harvard Extension School. In what precious free time remains, Lauren loves cooking with her partner, reading science fiction, especially by women authors, and doing whatever their 2 cats demand. Her partner grew up in Asheville, so Lauren is especially delighted that Malaprops is hosting this event. Welcome, Lauren. I've been so eager for this conversation, so enthralled was I by Saving History. So to get us started, I couldn't help but note that today is the birthday of Catherine Lee Bates, who penned those familiar lines in that famous patriotic anthem, "America, America, God shed his grace on thee." Well, that sentiment certainly seems to be apropos for our discussion. Lauren, I'll confess that this phenomenon of Christian heritage history tours is completely new to me. How did you find out about it? And what led you to write about it? So Lauren, please, welcome.
Thank you so much, Kirk. And thank you so much to Stephanie, to Joanna Ruth, to Elizabeth, to Patricia for putting this event together, to all of the wonderful friends and family and students that are joining us this evening. It's wonderful to see you all. Once upon a time, back in graduate school, I was thinking a lot about religion and tourism and identity. And I started wondering, what a combination of those things might look like for white evangelicals in the United States, which was my field of study. So I asked my good friend Google, okay, what about evangelicals, DC, is that a thing? And I started to find that these Christian heritage tours do in fact exist. They were quite visible with the right set of keywords. And the more I explored them, the more I wanted to know. So 6 tour companies graciously let me join them on some tours. And I participated in 9 tours over the course of 2 years in 2014 and 2015.
So, how did you decide on the format of the book? I found it such an intriguing blend of history lesson of evangelicalism in the U.S., but also some very wonderful stories of participants. And how did that come about? How did you decide ultimately how it would take shape?
Great question. And I had a lot of good input and early readers on this project who really shaped it. But if you want to write a good book, you need to read a good book. You need to read lots of them. So a lot of my inspiration was reading other ethnographies of religion, just other ethnographies in different fields, wonderful novels, and thinking, what is the story that people will want to read? I play around with a couple of different organizing schemes. I thought about leading you through a day of a tour, and was so exhausted by the time I got to 9 a.m. that I decided no one would want to read the rest of it. But it really came down to, how do the folks on these tours understand themselves in relationship to the nation? There's some roles that they play, and that to me was the most important takeaway. And that was how I wanted to structure the book. So I organized it into these 4 roles. They're the founders of the nation, the heirs to the Christian founding fathers. They're exiles. They've been evicted from their rightful place of power. They're victims. They are being persecuted by an anti-religious secular establishment. And they see themselves as saviors. They are here in DC to save the nation by saving its history. So that's the organizing scheme for their experience, and I wanted the book to reflect that.
So maybe this would be a good time to discuss the question, what is an evangelical? How do we define that?
Always a good question, and a definition I try to elude. My field in religious studies has been fighting about this since probably, I would say late 2015. We've been fighting about it much longer than that, but especially since the 2016 election, we've really directed some energy, and people out in the world beyond religious studies have taken notice that we don't really know what we mean when we say white evangelical. And I would not presume to define that term for all times and places. I will say that I use white evangelical to talk about people who live at a particular intersection of faith and politics and consumption. There's a great deal of buying and selling and consuming media and all sorts of things that go to this intersection. And that's what I'm getting at with this term, is trying to talk about that group of people. Others can debate whether they're real evangelicals, whether they're real Christians, what an evangelical should be. I'm interested in finding a term for this category that is recognizable as a political demographic and also as a consumer culture. Those are the folks I want to talk about.
So you mentioned that you were able to participate in quite a few of these tours, very specialized tours. Can you describe, and also that research took place in 2014, 2015. I'd be so curious to know what's happened since the election of 2016, and especially leading up to the election this year, 2020. Just whether do you think the tours have changed? Do you think the gist is largely unchanged?
I think first I should probably tell everyone what these tours are like. And then I can say a little bit more about what the intervening years may have brought. But if you've been to DC, you've probably experienced something quite similar to these tours. They go to the sites that are in all the major guidebooks. You spend time on Capitol Hill, time at the war memorials, visit Arlington, eat bad food at food courts, all the usual tourist experiences. And what's different for them is that they're telling stories about Christianity in the United States, and that includes Christian leaders, Christian people, and the Christian God as a real actor in American history. And those stories are constant. That's how they're sort of telling the back history of the nation. But there's also this other story, sort of a plot twist, of the idea that America is in decline. It's what we would call a Jeremiah in religious studies. Classic form of American preaching, by the way. But this idea that the nation has fallen from grace, that it is in decline, and that it needs saviors to come forward and redeem it. And that's a story that's also woven through their experience of Washington, D.C. And I want to think back to 2014, 2015. I was very young. Thinking about, that was the Obama administration, the sort of waning years. This is right before Obergefell, the decision that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide in June 2015. So it was a different moment than what we find ourselves in right now, or what we found ourselves in even before coronavirus disrupted all our lives. There was that really intense feeling even then for white evangelicals of just being under siege. The Affordable Care Act and some of the campaigns for legalization of same-sex marriage, there was this real sense of progressive values were winning and we need to take back the nation. And I've heard from a lot of folks that, would this change now? Would it change now that Trump is in office? There's a Republican Senate, there's all these judicial appointees. You'd think they would be more optimistic, that these tours would have sort of a happier tone about the United States. And I really think all we have to look at is the continuing public discourse about Christianity being under siege that we see in the presidential campaign, that we see all over social media if you inhabit the parts of the internet I do. This story isn't going anywhere. This idea that the nation is in decline and needs saving. President Trump's July 4th speech was a really great example of this, and his recent comments about Joe Biden and the Bible and God are relevant to this. And I think it's important that we recognize this story isn't new. This is something the Christian right created in the 1970s, and I trace that history in the book, of course. But it's also not going to disappear overnight. It really has political legs. It's a very powerful, strategic political move to claim this kind of outsider position. So my guess, I have not done further research recently. I don't think, well, I know tours were happening this year, but certainly I wasn't leaving my house. I don't think much would be different. If anything, really, I think there might be an amplification of that sense of persecution, because now that story is being told from the White House, just to reinforce that constant sense that we're exiles, we're victims, we need to save this country.
One of the curious dimensions you explore and explicate so well is that there are multiple roles going on at the same time. The tourists feel themselves to be insiders. They feel that sense of solidarity with the founding fathers, and it always seems to be fathers, white founding fathers, who are at the root of this. But on the other hand, they feel themselves to be outsiders, because with the growing, in their sense of this growing secularist threat to the country, they've been cast aside or cast out. And so then there's that element of being an exile. And then finally, there's that sense of being a savior. And maybe they can be the ones to save history, take the messages they've learned home with them, and spread the good word. It's fascinating how many dimensions are at play at once, sometimes contradictory, where it would seem to be.
Absolutely. No, and the contradictions, that's where the fun of the analysis is. I mean, I would dare any of us try to think of parts of our identity that are not in contradiction with each other. So I really want to emphasize that there's not an element of sort of confusion or hypocrisy. This is just how humans exist in the world.
Sure.
We find stories and sort of smash them together. and pick the ones that are relevant in a given moment, whether or not they make sense, sort of, as a whole. We're always moving through these stories and pulling different ones and playing different roles within them.
I think one of the inescapable questions that comes up is, to what degree are these pilgrimages of faith? And I was struck recently by a quote from one of my favorite poets, philosophers, David White, who put it this way: we take the pilgrim identity, we take the pilgrim path in order to get out from under ourselves and in order to escape the story, the confining story that we have been telling ourselves. Every human being is telling themselves some form of the story to make sense of the world. And the great question is whether the story you are telling yourself is open to any outside influence, any outside revelation. And I guess that's my question too. To what degree was there an openness to new revelation? And to what degree were the trips that you observed more confirmation of pre-existing notions, just solidifying what was already there?
Certainly. And some thoughts about pilgrimage that I'll return to. This question about preconceptions and sort of the way that they reinforce their own pre-existing ideas about the nation. I think that's a really apt description of what was happening. I mean, every opening, they would have dinner the first night and they would join in for that and be introducing myself, doing some of the small talk. And even at that first night, they would be telling me these stories that I would hear throughout the trip from the tour guides and from different tourists at different sites about how, they're going to take the inscription Last Deo, praise be to God, off the Washington Monument because they, are so anti-Christian. They're trying to take God off of everything. And this would be, within 15 minutes of the tour starting. So these were very, very familiar stories. And I do look in the book at some of the other films, media, books and literature, things that have similar stories that have really made this narrative about the nation widespread among white evangelicals. In some ways, it's also a selection bias of the folks who choose to come on a tour like this are already deeply familiar with these really embedded arguments that, again, have been around for 40 years. They've been passed through generations at this point. So people, they are expecting what they come to see. They're not expecting surprises. They're expecting proof. And that's really how the tours are marketed. If I could say something about pilgrimage, though,
sure,
Kirk, if you don't mind.
Please.
I just, that line captured me about experiencing new revelation or the presence of the sacred. And I wondered if I could read a scene from a tour just to give everyone an idea of what that might be.
That'd
like.
be wonderful.
It was one of my favorite scenes. So I just want to set the scene for everyone. It's really hot. It's summer in DC. We're sweating. We just climbed that little hill that feels like a mountain up to the Washington Monument. And we collapsed onto the benches. And we're waiting for our tour guide to come back with our tickets to the top. Most of us stayed put. It was hot on the plaza, but at least we had seats. A few people stood and spread out to take more pictures. I watched one man, Gary, pace around the monument with his hands in his pockets, as if inspecting the structure from different angles. His path brought him inward until he stood only an arm's length from the east wall. Slowly, almost furtively, we'd spent all week being told not to touch things by security guards. He reached out and placed his palm flat against the marble. Almost immediately he recoiled, shaking his hands. He stared at the wall, then turned and walked back to the group. "It's warm," he told us, with something like awe in his voice. Given that the marble blocks of the obelisk had been baking in the sun all day, it should perhaps come as no surprise that they would retain heat, even when the sun had moved to the west. But Gary, like the rest of us, was primed to experience the extraordinary in this place, not the ordinary. We were at the sacred center of the city and the nation. Is it so surprising then that he would touch warm marble and experience it as present or even transcendent? So I think getting at that dimension, that this is not just another selfie opportunity. It's not just sort of something for the scrapbooks or to tell the grandchildren about. It really is a desire to experience some sort of connection with God via forefathers. There's sort of a different set of arrangements we can think of, but it is that desire to feel present that animates the tours, and I think that is really the pilgrimage piece of this for me here.
That's wonderful and a great example. So there's a part of the experience that sounds a bit like a vacation. There's a part of the experience that sounds like pilgrimage or history lesson. And at one point, I know you talk about the tourist as an outsider, sort of that sense of what it means to and every tourist experiences this, that when we are in a new place, we don't feel at home, which stands to reason. But that in that moment, in that nexus of not feeling at home is also a powerful reminder of how it is that we are outsiders. And there was a specific passage, I was wondering if you might be willing to read, I think it was on page 108, that also gets back to this idea of pilgrimage, but also to this idea of just what the participants understand this experience to be.
Absolutely. That's a great selection. This is where I guess we'll talk about initiation. This point, I come back to this throughout the book, and I just want to clarify that only Americans go on vacation so that they can get up at the crack of dawn, drink some bad hotel coffee, haul themselves on buses, and go around and around the city, walking everywhere until 10 o'clock at night and say, we're getting our money's worth, and call it a vacation. It's really just it was a very strange dimension of this experience. It really shifted how I think about vacation. It's very, very different than a trip or tourism for me now after experiencing so many of these. But that is a big part of the outsider experience, that sort of feeling of alienation. But they're also there to be initiated into these ranks of the folks who know the real history. So I do talk about that a little, and really happy to read this. And I think this sums up sort of, if it's an initiation of this elect group, what does that look like? On Christian heritage tours of DC, white evangelical tourists learn how to be saviors of both history and the nation. Their experience of DC is not a vacation, but an initiation. They join the ranks of those who know the real story and who have seen the evidence for themselves. Armed with this knowledge, they're called to take action, usually in the form of being politically involved themselves, and supporting efforts to promote Christianity in the American public square. They're also reminded at every turn that their duty may involve sacrifice. In a city full of war memorials, it's impossible to forget how many people have already given their lives to save the nation. Christian heritage tours hold up American soldiers as exemplary saviors, second only to Christ. And tourist encounters with war memorials, Arlington National Cemetery, and especially veterans themselves, reinforce their sense of solemn obligation. Their own fight may not be on a battlefield, but the safety and survival of the nation are nonetheless at stake. So there's a real war for the soul of the nation, to use that phrase that is once again in our political discourse. There's a real commitment to fighting and taking all of the historical tools and evidence at one's disposal and using that to reclaim a Christian America. And seeing that really as in line with all the sacrifices that Americans have made before now, taking up that mantle of American saviors.
Wow. So did you find that there were tour guides or tourists, participants, who were engaged in reflective thinking and who had doubts about the narrative they had brought with them to Washington? Was that challenged at all?
Great question. And I want to think there was. I don't think these groups could possibly have been as homogenous as they really did appear to me. I think that there may have been some things behind the scenes that I was not privy to just because I was an outsider among outsiders in a certain way. but I didn't witness anyone challenging the tour guides. I didn't witness anyone asking critical questions of them. I occasionally would ask the awkward position of being an academic. People would ask me to verify what the tour guide had said, which was interesting, but it wasn't, they just wanted me to like say, yeah, this guy's really smart, right? They were looking for, you know, the detailed historiography of the Washington Monument. Nobody cares. They just wanted sort of a reinforcement. So there may have been some of that sort of pushback, but not enough that I witnessed and not that was expressed to me in follow-up interviews as well. It was very celebratory and righteous.
Yeah, interesting. As I read through a typical day or a typical tour, it felt sometimes like a scavenger hunt or a treasure hunt. Let's go find scriptural proof of this founding father or of this, or conversely, let's find evidence of the secularization of our culture, how this is all falling apart. There's a lot of reference to the prophets, the biblical prophets, to the Psalms, many references to the Psalms. But this sense of covenant, this sense of understanding seems very selective. In the whirlwind visits to monuments, the US Capitol, the Supreme Court, and the many museums, it seemed that there were some museums that were never visited. The African American Museum of Culture, for example. And that begs the question, too, since we're talking about the white founding fathers, of American exceptionalism as it relates to white supremacy. And what is your take on that? How does white supremacy figure into this narrative?
I'm going to start with museums and then I'll come to white supremacy because I have like 4 questions in one, but I'll really
Oh,
get
yeah,
that.
sorry.
So that the Museum of African American History and Culture was actually under construction while we were doing these tours. However, there was nothing flattering said about it. We would pass it on every bus ride, you know, you're sitting in traffic in DC for eternity. Criticism of the architecture, of the concepts. It was sort of a suggestion that there wouldn't be any religion there either because, you know, the government is not representing religion appropriately. Just sort of a dismissal of that idea, and really a dismissal of museums pretty widely. There's this deep distrust of sort of the historical establishment, which is an establishment that takes an enlightenment view that we're going to look for, you know, rational sources and sort of assume that we're not going to take into account God's role in a particular historical event. That's not what the Smithsonian, for instance, says. Just starting from a different set of presuppositions about what is historical knowledge, really. And folks on the tours are deeply threatened, troubled, challenged by that. A lot of what the tours are doing is to correct what museums are doing and to offer this hidden story of Christian America that has been erased from the museum. There's plenty of religion in American museums. There was a fantastic exhibit recently on religion in early American history at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. It's frequent, even before the Museum of the Bible, which we have not yet mentioned, but the Museum of the Bible is now there. There's religion all over DC. But those were optional. It was if you had a free afternoon, they would send people there. In part because Christian tour guides, private tour guides are often not allowed to lead discussion in the museums themselves because they're disruptive. So the museums were sort of the boogeyman in many ways during this tour. Now for the easy question of white supremacy after talking about museums. Really important question, really essential question. There's a reason I insist every time, to some people's annoyance, on calling them white evangelicals when I'm talking about this group. I think it's really critical to recognize that race matters and how people who are evangelical Christian behave politically as well as different other social patterns. And that we don't want to erase that there are people of color who are also evangelicals. That's one reason. The other reason is that we're looking at this religious group's relationship to a nation throughout history, and you can't do that without accounting for white supremacy and really paying attention to how, even at their most outsider points, they're not subject to the kind of violence that Black people, that Indigenous peoples in this country have been subject to. It's not the same thing, and I don't want to erase that distinction. So that's one place that white supremacy really is essential, and just knowing what we're talking about, and being able to ask the kinds of questions about these folks in history that really pay attention to power dynamics. So that's one thing. But then if we push it a little bit further and look at what they're doing with the term Christian, I think that's really where we see this danger of white supremacy cloaked in familiar language that is very subtle, that shifts what we think of as Christian to be this very narrow, white, usually male, always conservative kind of Christianity. And that's what you see in the tour. It's subtle because they're not saying outright, oh, Episcopalians, for instance, they're not really Christians. But they're only using Christians to talk about white people, and they're only using it to talk about conservative people. And in DC, there's not that many statues of women to begin with, so they're almost always talking about men. And I'll share one story that I think just represents sort of the tragedy of this in some ways. We were in the Capitol with a group of folks. We had a Black woman with our tour, and I was standing in the rotunda, eavesdropping a little bit with some women on the tour, and they're just complaining about this tour. And they're like, "Oh, this woman! Like, what is she talking about? Like, there's so many Christians here. Why is she talking about the Christian stuff?" This is sort of the narrative they were prompted to have whenever anyone's not talking about Christianity all the time. And so they're standing there talking about, like, why can't she talk about Christians? She was talking about a statue of Rosa Parks. And that really hit me. I was like, oh, this is the work of white supremacy in Christianity. This is erasing the experiences of a Black woman of faith because she does not fit into this particular intersection that has been defined Christianity. So I want to offer that for folks to reflect on when you're seeing the term Christian in the media, when you're using it yourself, whether describing yourself or others. Think about how capacious that term is, and how wide a net we could cast. And using it really narrowly in this way can do real harm. So be careful. These words matter.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So much to discuss. Lauren, I want to leave the other participants a chance to ask some questions. But before they do, I want to ask one that I hope is not too personal a question. But I thought you told the story in such a beautiful way, as I said before, crafting together the history of the evangelical movement, the role of politics, the other fellow participants in the program, and you rarely inserted yourself into the narrative. But there were a couple of times, and one in particular really struck me, which was when you were with a group of 8th graders and a World War II veteran, as I recall. And I wonder if you could recount that story and how it affected you, and in fact, how this whole experience of writing the book affected you.
Personal, but not too personal.
Okay.
Thank you for that question, Kirk. It's a gracious one. I appreciate the chance to reflect on it. The moment Kirk's mentioning is in, I think, the Saviors chapter of the book, and I recall this vividly because it troubled me. Even after writing it, it still troubles me really. We were at the World War II Memorial towards the end of the day, and I was with a group of 8th graders there on a Christian school trip. And there was a group of honor flight veterans who had pulled in behind us. And you see these in DC frequently. It's an organization that flies in veterans to visit. Takes care then make sure they have wheelchairs if needed. They have a person to care for them if needed. So we really try to make it accessible. And we see these folks, these men, getting off the bus behind us. And I'm like, okay, well, here are the heroes. Of course, we're going to drop everything and applaud, do something, recognize their presence. And instead, we just kind of went on as usual. The guide kept giving his speech. There was a real disconnect for me. This is where I felt really sort of double consciousness. Was like I had been primed to be like, oh yeah, the veterans are here. Let's celebrate. They deserve this. And it's so frustrating when they didn't do that. So I was torn in that moment. And this is one of the moments I was torn, and I do reflect on it in the book. Just what did I expect? Did I expect 8th graders who've been cooped up on a bus all day to sort of behave according to the script that these tours were offering? What was I looking for? But I remember, I do mention that I thought of my own grandfather, who was a veteran, who I wish could have experienced that kind of celebration and honor, and just that. Yeah, it was very strange. So there were moments, as an ethnographer, you have to sort of be aware of how your own emotions and biases and experiences are affecting what you see, but also go with the flow. Like, it's not about me. It was not my place to jump in and say, hey guys, like, did you notice? Like, can we do something? That wasn't my role. And I went to get water or something, and came back, and they had gathered around this group, and they were doing the celebratory thing. And I was just like, okay, I can't. This is just, there's no predicting really where this is going to go. So I don't know. As I said, this still troubles me, that reaction and that strangeness. There were moments in the tours where I really felt myself, like I said, an outsider among outsiders. And that was one of them. And that's one I haven't quite made sense of yet. I just know it was that they didn't behave the way I expected them to, or I think the way they expected them to. It's a strange moment of disconnect.
So I have a question from our audience, which is, what is your most important literary influence ever? Just kidding. But it would be interesting to know what has influenced you along the way to bring you to this point.
Sure. And I realized I skipped the latter part of your previous question, which is about, what was it like writing this book, doing this research, that sort of thing. So I think these two are probably intertwined. Obviously, I'm a nerd. I'm an academic. I read a lot of academic stuff. I have been shaped by a lot of really wonderful intellectuals in my career. I've been shaped by my students, who are pushing me, who are asking the rude questions that no one else would dare ask. Those have been really important influences, just that academic spaces. But writing this book, it was also a real reflection, I think, on who I am and who I wanted to be. Being the outsider in these spaces and being sort of uncomfortable and fitting in some ways, but not in others, really affected me and really pushed me, especially once I was done with the ethnography and I was writing the book, to really think, what are my values in relation to what I'm seeing here? Where do I fall? The answer is quite far away, to be frank. But really, this was a really critical moment in my life. I was in my 20s writing this. I like to think I've grown up quite a lot since then. So that in itself was a big influence on me. Just this experience, and then the horrific experience of writing a book. I say to a room full of readers and booksellers and writers, it is such a long process. There's so much time for reflection and revisiting and seeking your own voice. And I think I said to Kirk, the conclusion chapter, I think, is where I really found my voice. The 11th hour and trying to get it into my core publisher. But just the process of having to recount this experience and make meaning of it was a really life-shaping kind of experience for me.
Thank you for that. There's a follow-up question to a point we discussed earlier, which is, you mentioned that you didn't hear anyone question the tour guides or challenge them. But did anyone question any of the dominant narrative when you were apart from the tour, when you were talking with them just alone? Was there any hint at that point of a crack in the armor, so to speak?
There were little swipes at the tour guides as sort of know-it-alls. One in particular. Sorry, my headphones are dying, so I'm going to swap out while Kirk asks the next question, but I'll finish answering this one.
Sure.
There was not pushback, really. Just maybe little complaints, we don't walk this much. They sort of, in some ways, saw me as gathering feedback that I would give to the tour companies. Like, they would tell me their complaints about the food or whatnot. But it was only praise for the sort of historical component, not substantial critique, challenge, or anything like that.
So another question. Have the scandals that have surrounded the Museum of the Bible in relation to the provenance and authenticity of their artifacts affected the image and status of the museum among evangelicals?
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just
fine. I can hear
fine.
you. One moment.
Sure. Are you able to hear?
Right. I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Yes.
All right, now we're both flight controllers together. Excellent.
Okay, great.
I should have known my fashionable earbuds would not last the hour.
That's all right.
All right. Yes. So the question about the Museum of the Bible. Oh yes. Where to start? I really want to emphasize that this is a worldview in which any kind of critique fuels the sense of righteousness. So we can expect, and we've seen this, the sort of academic critiques, the legal cases, any of these challenges to the Museum of the Bible, its collection. It's just one more attack from the left trying to discredit a museum that's trying to spread the good news. There's a way of interpreting this. This is a framework of interpretation that we see all over the place. It's just perfect for the Museum of the Bible. Any of these scandals, whether it's the authenticity of a text, the provenance, lawsuits about it, like all that does is just reinforce the sense of persecution. It doesn't sort of detract from the museum's authority. If anything, it reinforces it, because in this outsider persona, you gain the moral high ground when people are opposed to you. So really, they couldn't have paid for a better publicity campaign in some ways. It really works well.
And as you said before, to sort of trudging through the hot streets of Washington until 10 o'clock at night only forged a stronger bond too. There is that sense of we're in this together.
Yes.
And they may be against us, but we're in it together.
Definitely.
So here's a question I'll read. It's a bit lengthy, but I think it brings up an important point. Dr. Kerby, thank you so much for this. In the current cultural and political climate, it's hard not to hear the language of conspiracy theory in the way the tour groups speak. There's so much about secret histories and about struggles against a mysterious them. Did you get a sense of how organized these folks thought they were? In other words, were white evangelical Christians being removed from their rightful place by an impersonal process of cultural degeneration or by some actual cabal? I know it's a mouthful, but it's a
Oh, that's a
Interesting question.
fantastic question, though. The answer is definitely a very distinct cabal, probably based at my current employer, Harvard University. So it's me
Uh,
and my academic colleagues and our allies in government. It's a really uh, it's a really distinct set of enemies. And it's sort of a rotating cast. You know, you can plug and play with this story. It doesn't really matter which enemy it is. It could be the feminists. It could be the gay rights folks. It could be the folks out for racial equity. It could be the secularists. Secularist was a really common sort of catch-all for this. Um, it's the left elite. It's the folks who occupy positions of power in institutions that do not recognize the United States as a Christian nation. So it was really quite specific, actually. And I should note that, of course, Satan is lurking in the background of all of these people. Um, you know, it's apocalyptic. It's a real sense that there is a war between good and evil, and we're on the side of good, and these very specific people on the other side are out to get us.
Wonderful. Wonderful answer. Another question. The authors of the founding documents of our country were trying to build in considerable separation between church and state, partly because they were anti monarchists. Do evangelical tours make any attempt to address this building block or a related one, religious freedom? Are these concepts simply ignored or reinterpreted somehow?
Interesting. There's a real distinction between separation of church and state, which is as close as you can get to a swear word on these tours, and religious freedom, which of course is a thing we're all excited about, but no one really seems to know what it means, which I think is true across the United States, and I'll say more about that. Um, Separation of church and state is something that these tours are explicitly trying to reject, really pushing against this idea that the founders wanted any kind of distinction between faith and government. They really, really want people to believe that church and state is an aberration. It's in a letter that Jefferson signed. It was a throwaway line. And they provide all kinds of evidence to support this idea that the founders themselves would welcome a fusion of religion and government. Thomas Jefferson paid the Marine Corps band to play at church services in the newly built US Capitol during his presidency, for instance. The list goes on. Religious freedom, though, is so complicated because I remember there was this another moment of like odd juxtaposition. I remember one day we were outside the Ronald Reagan International Trade Center. They go there for the food court, yes, because it is named after Ronald Reagan. But there's a statue of one of the first Jewish Americans to hold a cabinet position, I believe. And they were talking about this. This is great. This is America. This is a celebration of religious freedom. The very next day, the same guide read from the Delaware State Constitution a passage about how one has to accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior in order to serve in state government. And there was no sense of dissonance there. So it does, religious freedom is like a great way to think about American exceptionalism. They will sometimes use it that way. But it isn't always consistent. And religious freedom for them, and even more so since I did this research, has really come to mean white conservative Christians being exempt from rules about equality that the rest of society has deemed appropriate. So thinking of religious freedom sort of as carving out this space where we do not have to do things we don't want to do because it's within our, it's about our religion. And that's a real shift. That's a real shift that I think is worth paying attention to. Much as we pay attention to how Christian is used, I think seeing the kind of work that this phrase religious freedom does in our public and political discourse is worth watching.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. So there's I keep thinking of the word covenant to describe this understanding, particularly the covenant as explored in Judeo-Christian scripture. And that to the degree America walks in the way God intended, America will be blessed. To the degree it doesn't, it will suffer the consequences. The sense of being the new Israel or even the new Jerusalem. But how does social justice figure into that covenant? Is there a sense of conscience around addressing issues regarding racism or the economic disparities, the health disparities in our nation? Did that come up at all?
The short answer is no. Though social justice was right up there with separation of church and state as sort of a dismissive term of like, that's what the other side wants. It's just a code word, that sort of thing. And I do want to tell a story that didn't make it into the book. And I want to be very clear, this is one tour guide. This is not representative of the whole group. But it so horrified me, it stuck with me in response to this question about poverty in particular. Standing with these groups, one of these groups at the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, which is huge, right around the tidal basin. And the guide was telling us about how FDR was just wrong about everything. And he was so arrogant to think that the New Deal could end poverty because, quote, Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah, it's there again, just moments like that where it really struck me like I am in a different world than where I usually am. So again, one person, but there was a lot of discussion of everything will be better if the nation will be better if we're all more individually responsible. Children are raised in two-parent heterosexual households. Kids stay in school. Prayer is in school. Lots of schools were a big piece of sort of the solution that they saw. Things like inequity, systemic racism, those were not part of the conversation.
Yeah.
And that's a shame.
Interesting. It is. It is. So I guess the question is, where do you go from here? What's your next project?
I've been joking around about, there's a Christian version of everything. They have cruises that are specifically for Christians. So I've been joking, but now, there's coronavirus. I don't know that my university would see cruises as a particularly enriching field of study. But I am working with students in the Religious Literacy Project and sort of in my own research, thinking about storytelling and thinking about the stories we tell about ourselves and our communities and how we can make those conscious so that we can choose better stories. We can imagine better stories. We're not stuck with the old scripts that we inherited from the Christian right or others in our past. So that's where I'm at.
Wow. Fascinating. Well, Lauren, what an enriching conversation and enriching evening. And for those who haven't yet seen it, the book, Saving History, is available, as I understand it, from Malaprops. And I'd like to turn things back over to Stephanie, maybe, to say a word about that.
Thank you so much, Kirk. First of all, I just want to say thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Kirk. Also, thank you, Elizabeth and Joanna Ruth. This has been really fascinating, and I'll just say a little chilling at times as well. Actually, but yeah, just a lot to think about in this conversation because it's such an interesting kind of focused look at something that you're. Or at least I've been sort of aware of in general in terms of reading the news and seeing certain kinds of ideas pop up, but this very specific kind of activity that feeds into some of these larger narratives it's just been really fascinating to hear you share about that. So as Kirk said, we of course encourage you to pick up a copy of the book and read more. If you would like to do that, we have it available through the Malaprops website. And Lauren has also sent us some signed book plates. So we're not in a position to do, as a rule, the kind of usual author book signing that we would normally do after an event. when we have people, authors joining us in from everywhere, but we have signed book plates available, so you can get a signed copy that way if you would like. It's especially nice if you think it would make a nice gift for someone. If you are not in the Asheville area, we do ship, but we're also delighted for you to purchase Lauren's book from your local independent bookseller. We are all in it together, small business and independent businesses and indie booksellers everywhere. So if Malaprops is not your home store, but you have a home store, please support them, especially right now during the pandemic. And so I will just say thank you so much again to everyone who's been with us this evening. Thank you for joining us in the audience. And Lauren, in particular, thank you so much again for writing this book and sharing this with us. Yeah, it's been fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for being here. It's really a lovely group. Thank you.
Great, everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much again. We'll wish everyone a wonderful evening, and we look forward to seeing you again at another event here online, and then eventually back in the bookstore. So thanks so much again, everyone.
Thank
Have
you.
a great